चमक उठे हैं सलासिल.
Now That the Chains Glimmer, a podcast for friends by friends, presented by Hik Rosa, Comintern Works and Gcash Jahan, hosted by Asma Abbas.
In this podcast, we will attempt to talk about a living politics for today, trying to step away from the usual ways of discussing geopolitics, internationalism, and domestic affairs of post-colonial countries in the global south by turning to the history, present, and future of the people in those spaces. We hope for a language in common to be able to return to a politics that allows us to think of the world as both made by us and unmade by us, and to understand that it is still within our reach to change it and make it look like something that might resemble dreams we have inherited and the dreams we have been weaving ourselves. आज हम चले हैं कुछ दूसरी तरह की बातें करने, उस सियासत की बातें जो जिंदगी से भरपूर हो, जो हमारी जिंदगी का हिस्सा हो, जो हमें जिंदा होने का एहसास दिलाए, जो ये याद दिलाए कि हम ही इस दुनिया को बनाते और बिगाड़ते हैं. शायद हमें ऐसे वक्तों में इन कुछ बातों से तक़वियत मिले. In today's episode, my friends Hassan Mujtaba, Ali Usman Qasmi, Sandhya Davison, Sabina Qazi will initiate our conversation by sharing some thoughts on the issue of how to speak of imperialism in a time of neoliberalism, what options, what discourses are available for us so that we might venture away from some old encrusted and unproductive political habits, even on the left. And Hassan Mujtaba will share a page from history. Then we will be joined by special guests, Majid Shahada and Shakuntala Banaji. Welcoming everybody to the second episode of Now That Chains Glimmer, Chamak Uthe Hai Salasil, podcast about ordinary politics by friends for friends. We are together here with our soon-to-be regulars and some special interlocutors, special friends who have joined us today. I will quickly introduce them. The broad theme of the conversation today. I want to introduce first my friend Sandhya Davison from Delhi. Sandhya is my co-host. She is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. She has studied English literature and philosophy at Lady Shri Ram College and Jawaharlal Nehru University. She works on conceptual structures in continental philosophy and modes of philosophical thought in particular that are postmodern and anti-colonial, depending on the day. And of course, is actively involved in politics as an activist and as an advocate for what is good in the world and what can be. Sandhya and I were both on the trail of other ways of thinking about politics beyond nation state and, the limitations of the market model of politics. Then I'm joined by another friend, Hassan Mujtaba, who is a journalist and a poet. He's a Pakistani poet in exile, lived in the US, and I have coined the term truth teller in exile for Hassan. He has worked on the persecution of Hindus in Sindh and had to leave the country harassed by the government at that time. Part of essential features of Pakistani journalistic democracy like Newsline. His poetry collections have abounded both in Urdu and in Sindhi in an Arendian sense. He is a lover of the world. Then my dear friend Ali Usman Qasmi, who is currently at Stanford University but hails from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. He has studied at the South Asia Institute of Heidelberg and fellowships at various places. He's writing currently about the history of the 1950s in Pakistan, an important decade in the history of the country and the region, the world, given the conversations we began 2 weeks ago about internationalism and, post-colonial possibilities of solidarity. So we are very excited that he will keep adding his wisdom and very astute and erudite interventions into the narratives of history that keep shaping us day to day. So with us, there's also Sabina Qazi, who is a journalist with a keen interest in current affairs, which she has brought into her academic work as an educator in order to explain it in theory through the prism of literature. Welcome, Sabina. finally, our two guest interlocutors, Majid Shahada, he is, as one might say, a very independent scholar. His work has focused on decolonization, modernity, violence, identity, and the anthropology of politics and politics of knowledge. He has published several books and articles and has been essential to the creation of the disciplines of border studies in the U.S. Academy, and also resistance to Israeli occupation in Palestine, having been one of the founders of the U.S. Academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And Shakuntala Banerjee is a dear friend joining currently from London, who is professor of media, culture, and social change at the London School of Economics, and also directs the program in media, communication, and development. Her work is on international media and with a focus on the global South and cinema, and she approaches critically the question of media and development, cares about the youth, writes about them and children and media, as well as gender, ethnicity, and new media and cinema, and having written copiously on Orientalism and racism in media. And her recent work deals with disinformation, misinformation, and fake news, creativity, democracy, the internet, social media, and civic participation. So that's our group of friends for today. And I just want to introduce the theme that is going to be shaping some of our conversations and introduce some of the segments we will have today. We're trying to think about how the language of US intervention and imperialism is being deployed in various regions of the world right now, given whatever the US is doing in relationship to NATO and in whatever ways it has become an actor in South Asia of late, as if it was ever not an actor. But there's a certain way that it's being invoked with great shock and surprise, but it is also leading to a very placid, predictable, recycled discourse of an uncritical discourse of empire and imperialism, without actually assessing in what ways imperialism, as Lenin called it, the highest stage of capitalism and the stage that introduced finance capital to the world, and also in a certain way saw us into the era of what we call neoliberalism. There's a certain way that it behooves us to think about the categories and the manners in which we discuss the role of certain countries in geopolitics and the lives of everyday subjects, and really think about how to exit a Cold War discourse on geopolitics, but still retain an element of resistance against empire, and also be able to update our understandings of imperialism by factoring in how neoliberalism pushes all of those elements that might have been external and that might have been able to be divided up into interior and exterior politics of countries, or domestic or international politics of countries, right into the subjects of fascism. And so that's sort of the general challenge for us today. I will invite Sandhya, of course, to begin with some.
Thanks so much, Asma, for laying out the program for today, even though it's not supposed to be programmatic in any sense at all. Apart from some of the things that you mentioned, especially for this week, I was kind of thinking about the ways in which we are or are not able to speak, especially in our particular circumstances at this moment, and whether, especially certain instances that have taken place over the week for me in this country, in India, I've been thinking of whether it is even possible to put up any kind of viable resistance to neoliberalism, and if that is possible, then what is the language that might take? What kinds of articulations might be possible which are not easily set aside or dismissed by the regime, by everybody else? Because there is definitely very sustained kind of a juggernaut against all kinds of utterances against the regime. And anyone who speaks is being silenced in many ways. Especially in this last week, I've been thinking about speech and silence and the mediations between the two. And if there is silence, then what forms of political silence can we make use of? If there is speech, what kinds of speech can we make use of? Which again is not just something that cannot be easily dismissed, but something that can actually be heard. And of course, I don't want to go back and repeat the same, can the subaltern speak? But how do we speak today with all of this misinformation campaigns that are swirling around us? Every newspaper is complicit. Every news media is complicit. Social media is saturated with all of these forms of disinformation. I have seen WhatsApp messages in this past week which are openly calling for genocide, where they are literally calling for an erasure of Muslims from this country. So against that kind of onslaught, I was wondering what forms of resistance we could actually put up, which cannot be easily mocked at or laughed out of the room, so to speak. So that is one of my primary concerns for, I think, for today, and that's something that I've been grappling with. Beyond all of that, I'm also very concerned about the defeatism that all of this brings, the kind of fatalism that all of this brings in our spaces and in our country. At this point, I've talked to hundreds of people, and they all have to say the same thing, and they all talk about the loss of hope. And even erstwhile supporters of the regime now say that there seems to be no way out of this morass. And in that sense, there is a complete cessation of any future possibility, or seemingly the loss of that kind of hope. And how do we not only get out of fatalism and defeatism, but how do we come up with new concepts or new vocabularies or new language to combat this really, in a very, very sustained, practical, pragmatic manner? How to also reinvigorate those old spaces of activism, the universities, which today have they've been shut down as spaces of dissent. Just last week, DU issued a letter saying now anyone who wants to protest is allowed to protest, but there is a form that you have to fill out, citing the name of the protester, the number of protesters that you are expecting, the time of these protests, and from when to when, the numbers of the main organizers who can be reached out to, and they have to sign it's like a personal kind of bond that you're signing, and you're giving that to the same authorities that you're protesting against. So how do we deal with all of these new tactics and strategies that we are now facing, and how do we launch any kind of sustained action is what I have been thinking about.
Thank you so much, Sandhya. I'm wondering, Sabina, you're nodding through what Sandhya was saying, and given what we've been speaking about, is this a good time for you to jump in and share some of your thoughts?
So the reason that I nodded was because, two things. You said disinformation. How does one sift through disinformation? How does one decide that I will go to the State Bank website and I will see these numbers and I will screenshot them and share them on my social media, on my Twitter account or Facebook or Instagram, whatever. And I will show people. I'm obviously talking with reference to what's happening in Pakistan, right? And of course, this is, most people don't understand what the budget is. They don't understand what GDP is. What does it mean for the GDP to have grown? Or there is no basic understanding. It's not taught in schools. If it is taught in schools, for example, my eldest is 13. She is slowly now being introduced to economics, for example. And the teacher has already said in class that I'm a fan of Imran Khan. And when you look at economics, try to understand that there is a lot of, most of you are now slowly joining social media, and they are 13, 14, 15, almost everyone has an Instagram account. And these are little children, and they are already being told by their teachers in most schools that this is the right person to follow. And so don't trust what the State Bank of Pakistan says. Okay, even the State Bank of Pakistan is lying. And okay, let's assume that the State Bank of Pakistan is lying. How does one sift through all this information or disinformation, whatever we want to call it? That's one thing. The other thing, the whole idea of speech and silence. Asma, we've grappled with this, haven't we? At universities, as someone who I've had to face it in a classroom where, how much can I say? How much can I say? I'm teaching something out of a book, but I have to be careful how I say it. Okay, it is obviously an author I trust, which is why I am referring to it, right? It's a chapter from some book and I am referring to it. I'm encouraging my students to read it. But somewhere I have to stop myself, because if I do, they say, Miss, why do you hate Pakistan? Why do you hate Pakistan, Miss? Miss, why are you supporting the chores? This has become, I know it sounds like a cliche, and, in academic conversation, this just sounds, for the lack of a better word, just stupid. Who talks like this? But this is it. In classrooms, in schools, as a mother, I'm waiting for my child to come outside, and I have a bunch of mothers. One of them is in advertising, another one is a banker. Some of the others are stay-at-home moms, and everyone's talking about Imran Khan, and everyone is looking at me because I've made it clear through my social media that I don't support Imran Khan. And they're talking about him and they're looking at me. What are my choices at that point? Should I speak up? If I speak up, they will turn against me and they will turn against my child. It is already happening. This is a school. It's supposed to be a silly, casual conversation. And if I get up and I walk away, they will continue talking. And they'll say, oh, ut ke chali gayi. Is it okay that I've said that in Urdu? Okay. For me right now, these are the biggest things. This whole, like, when do you speak and when do you remain silent? When does one draw the line? And if you are a writer, or if you are a journalist, or if you are a poet and you are putting this down, then you are a ghaddar, because you are a traitor on a much bigger scale. You're not just a mother talking to a bunch of other mothers in school, or a teacher, a lecturer at a university. You are a ghaddar. So this whole, the idea of speech and silence, and this, what you said about disinformation, for me, these are very big things right now. I feel like we are grappling with these issues right now in Pakistan.
Thanks, Sabina. Absolutely. Hassan, on that note, could you enter the conversation?
Thank you very much, everyone. Every Sathi, I will just recall a forgotten page or a couple of pages from history, which is almost unwritten yet. Our پاکستان میں جو لیفٹ کے خلاف پکڑ دھکڑ تھی یا تشدد ٹارچر تھا نان اسٹیٹ اور اسٹیٹ سینکشن وہ تو پاکستان بننے سے ہی شروع ہو چکا تھا there are a lot of ironies. Mainly جو میرا ہے forgotten page of history وہ یہ کہ how the religious right started violence in Pakistan and especially against left and globally or locally. تو اس پہ آنے سے پہلے تھوڑا سا میں پیچھے جاؤں گا بیک ہسٹری. پیچھے کے پاکستان بننے سے آئرنیز یہ ہے کہ اس وقت جو ہے ہمیں کہا جاتا ہے اور ہم سب کہتے ہیں کہ چین جو ہے پاکستان کا سب سے عظیم دوست ہے اور شہباز شریف نے بھی کہا کہ ہمالیہ سے بلند بحر عرب سے ڈیپر دین دی عربین سی اینڈ ہائر دین ہمالیاز. مگر 49 میں ایک پمفلیٹ چھپتا ہے کہ انقلاب زندہ باد اور وہ پمفلیٹ پیپلز پبلشنگ ہاؤس لاہور چھاپتا ہے اور وہ فورفیٹ ہو جاتا ہے. پمفلیٹ بین ہوتا ہے اور پبلشر کو سزا ہوتی ہے, پریس ضبط ہوتی ہے اور یہ ساری چیزیں ہوتی ہیں. وہ پمفلیٹ جو ہے 49 میں ابھی ماؤ کا انقلاب آئے نہیں تھا, ہی واز آن اے لانگ مارچ, اور اسی کے حق میں تھا اور وہ پمفلیٹ سجاد ظہیر نے لکھا تھا اینڈ اٹ واز بینڈ. اور پھر 60s میں ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ چین کے ساتھ جو ہے پینگیں بڑھائی جاتی ہیں اور پھر حبیب جالب نے اسی وقت ہی کہا تھا کہ چین اپنا یار ہے پر وہاں جو نظام ہے اس طرف نہ جائیو, اس کو دور سے سلام. تو 60s تک تو یہ ہوتا رہا. مگر 60 تک ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ جو ہے اسٹیٹ وائلنس اگینسٹ لیفٹ وہ تو تھا ہی اپنی جگہ پہ, پر اسٹیٹ سینکشن وائلنس اگینسٹ لیفٹ ابھی شاید اتنا شروع نہیں ہوا تھا. اور اسٹیٹ نے 59 میں ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ حسن ناصر واز made disappeared اور لاہور کے شاہی قلعے میں was tortured to death. مگر اس سے بھی پہلے میرا گمنام ہیرو یورش قمر was a labor rights activist. اسے جو ہے ہاتھ سے پمفلیٹ لکھتا ہے ماشاء اللہ مرد آباد ایوب خان کے خلاف. This was the first any political literature اور he was taken away, whisked away, tortured in لاہور شاہی قلعہ اور بہت عرصے تک وہ وہاں جیل میں رہا. تو 60s تک یہ سب چلتا رہا. ایوب خان کا دور تھا. ایوب خان والے ملاؤں کے اس میں وہ نہیں جھکاؤ اس کا ہوا تھا جب تک 65 وار شروع نہیں ہو. جب 65 وار شروع ہو جاتی ہے تو ایک جنگوازم شروع ہو جاتی ہے. اس وقت ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ لیفٹ اور رائٹ دونوں کے جو پوائٹس ہیں بڑی بڑی قومی نغمے لکھ رہے ہیں. اور آئرانی یہ ہے کہ آپ دیکھیں کہ اس وقت وہ اینٹی سوشلسٹ اینٹی لیفٹ ہے جو ہے حکمران طبقہ بھی اور جو ہے رائٹ بھی اور سارے. مگر اس وقت جو نغمے لکھے جا رہے ہیں اس میں اب سب سے اہم جو قومی نغمہ ہے جو ابھی پاپولر ہوا خطہ ہے لاہور تیرے جانثاروں کو سلام. اس کی ایک لائن ہے لاہور کے لیے کہ تو ہے اسٹالن گراڈ اس سرزمین پاک. اس زمانے میں کہ جب یہ پورا ہو رہا تھا تو اس وقت ہم نے جو سبق پڑھے ایلیمنٹری اسکولز میں جب ٹیکسٹ بکس میں سبق شامل ہو گئے کہ جہاں 65 کی وار میں فوجی جوانوں نے جو ہے بم باندھ کر سینے پہ انڈین ٹینکوں کے سامنے سو گئے. تو کنسپٹ آف ہراکاری کے بعد جو کنسپٹ آف سوئسائڈ بامبنگ تھا دیٹ واز اسٹارٹڈ بائی وہ جو تھا پاکستان آرمی کہ بھائی غلط یا برابر. میرا نہیں خیال کہ یہ ہوا ہوگا کہ فوجیوں نے بم باندھ کر جو ہے میجر کپتانوں نے جو ہے ٹینک اڑائے ہوں گے انڈین پر ایک ایسا ہوا کھڑا گیا. اس کا نتیجہ یہ ہوا کہ 69 ہی وہ دور ہے جو کہتے ہیں کہ سب سے زیادہ جو لبرل پرسنلی جو فوجی ڈکٹیٹر تھا وہ یحییٰ خان تھا. یحییٰ خان سیکولر ان ہز لائف وہ کہا جاتا, اور بہت ہی ہیوی ڈرنکر اور یہ ساری چیزیں, پر اس کے باوجود بھی ہی ہائرڈ مولویز. نواب زادہ شیر علی خان جو جنرل تھا ریٹائرڈ انفارمیشن منسٹر, انہوں نے اسے یہ بتایا کہ نظریہ پاکستان کی حفاظت کی جائے. اب وہ نظریہ پاکستان, نظریہ اسلام یہ شروع ہوتا ہے. اب وہ آج تک کسی نے اس کی ڈیفائن نہیں کر سکا سکسیسفلی کہ واٹ از آئیڈیالوجی آف پاکستان, آخر کس جانور کا نام ہے. نو ون ہسٹورین, کوئی اکیڈمیشین آج تک یہ نہیں بتا سکا کہ آئیڈیالوجی آف پاکستان آخر ہے کیا. تو قصہ آگے چلتا ہے. 1970 فیبروری 1970 میں 104 کلرجی نے اور مولویوں نے فتویٰ دیا کہ سوشلزم جو ہے کفر ہے, اور سوشلزم کا مطلب ہے بھائی کی بہن سے شادی. That's what they said. اور مگر کم نومبر 1 1970 وہ دن ہے جب کراچی میں جماعت اسلامی ایفیلیٹڈ پیاسی یونین ایئر یونین جو تھی پی آئی اے یونین, کراچی ایئرپورٹ پر ایک شخص فیروز عبداللہ کیٹرنگ ڈرائیور تھا, اس نے جو ہے اوور رین کیٹرنگ ٹرک اوور وزٹنگ پریزیڈنٹ تھا اس زمانے میں پولینڈ کا, اس کو اٹیمپٹ کی جب when he was being introduced to local dignitaries on a tarmac and raid park. Polish president تو بچ گیا, مگر وائس فارن منسٹر he was killed on the spot. اور اس کے ساتھ جو ہے وائس فارن پولش منسٹر, اس کے ساتھ ایسوسیٹڈ پریس کا فوٹوگرافر اشرف بیگ, یاسین احمد he was again ایسوسیٹڈ پریس انفارمیشن ڈپارٹمنٹ کا تھا, پاکستان انفارمیشن ڈپارٹمنٹ کا, اینڈ نذیر احمد چودھری نذیر احمد he was a special branch intelligence office police officer civilian, and 17 were injured. I mean 70 most of were the children جو گلدستے پیش کرنے آئے تھے. Though جماعت اسلامی denied any association with Feroz Abdullah, but how he had an access to the catering truck on the tarmac, اور وہاں کس طرح پہنچا اتنی انر, اور he was a member of پیاسی. یہ دیکھتے ہیں کہ یہ پہلا جو ہے ریلیجس رائٹ وائلنس ہے جو وہاں شروع ہوا ہے. اس زمانے میں 2 نومبر 70 کی نیو یارک ٹائمز لکھتا ہے کہ وہ جو فیروز عبداللہ تھا اس نے کہا تھا کہ میں نے اس لیے اس کو قتل کیا, پولش وزیر خارجہ کو, سوشلسٹوں اور کمیونسٹوں کو قتل کرنا چاہیے اور یہ جو ہے واجب القتل ہے. تو یہ ساری چیزیں ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ سید ابو الاعلیٰ مودودی کی رائٹنگ سے جو ہے سید قطب تک متاثر ہوتے ہیں, اخوان پوری اس پہ ہوتی ہے, اور پورا جو ہے اس کے بعد ایک ہم نے دیکھا کہ لیفٹ کے ساتھ جو ہوا 60s آتی ہے. 60s میں کیمپس وائلنس جو ہے اس میں رائٹ جو اسلامی جمعیت طلبہ ہے وہ زیادہ وائلنس اختیار کرتی ہے, لیفٹسٹوں کو مار پڑتی ہے. لاہور میں پنجاب یونیورسٹی ہب ہے جہاں لیاقت بلوچ, حافظ سلمان پر, اور اس طرف جو ہے لیفٹ کے لوگ پرویز رشید وغیرہ اور زبریاب احمد, ان کی بڑی اور ہمارا دوست my friend مصدق ساول کم 80s, اور he lost his eye in a beating by جماعت اسلامی goons, اور کم کراچی یونیورسٹی, اور ڈاکٹر حسن ظفر عارف واز فورسڈ ٹو ریزائن, اور وہاں پروفیسر جمیل عمر اصغر خان, مشاہد حسین تک, اور ہمارا دوست ڈاکٹر منظور اعجاز who is now here in Washington. So ایک پرج ہوتی Professor Azizuddin Ahmad. So what I'm saying that violence in Pakistan, extremist violence, especially violence against labor, is started by the religious right. The religious right means سب کی جو نانی اماں تھی وہ جماعت اسلامی تھی, اسلامی جمعیت طلبہ, اسلامی چھاتر و شنگو. آخری بات یہ کہوں گا کہ ہم یہ کہتے ہیں 70 years of history پاکستان کی بیان کرتے ہیں تو اس میں ہم بھول جاتے ہیں کہ کبھی غلطی سے بنگالی بھی, ایسٹ بنگال بھی ہمارا پاکستان کا حصہ تھا, وہ کیوں الگ ہوا اور ہم نے ان کے ساتھ کیا سلوک کیا اس پر کوئی بات نہیں کرتا. مشرقی پاکستان کے حالات کو اب ری انیکٹمنٹ جو ہو رہی ہے عمران خان پرامپرا, یہ وہی ہو رہی ہے. لاہور پنجاب اسمبلی جو ہم وہاں کر چکے ہیں اس پاکستان میں. تو اسلامی چھاتر و شنگو, اسلامی جمعیت طلبہ کا بنگالی بنگلہ ورژن, they turned into the خوفناک Al-Shams Al-Badr, but they were on the shoulder to shoulder with Pakistan Army genocide against Bengalis. اور میرا یہ تھا سر. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, right now we see the pact between Imran Khan and the Jamaat-e-Islami getting stronger, and just a particular new version of that. Thank you. Ali, some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic again, like that you have together such excellent speakers and there's so much to learn from them. And I would like to take forward what Sandhya was saying about what are the possible forms of resistance that we can think of in this particular moment. I mean, I am thinking, I have very parochial kind of interest, so I'm thinking more in terms of South Asia rather than globally, because that's the region I'm more intimately familiar with. And I feel that still, even when we say regionally, it has a very, very global import. It's like, more than 1/3 of the people live in this part of the world. And there is a strong resonance where you can feel where, it's very common to recall what happened during the interwar period and the similar kinds of, it does not have to unfold, this kind of fascism does not have to unfold exactly in the same manner. Yet there are so many similarities, right? So it does not have to be like a checkbox. Oh, if Modi has done that, and then only then we will be able to say that yes, this is fascism. No, it will play out. The script will be played out slightly differently, but there are absolutely horrible signs which are visible, very visible, that we are this close to an outburst of incredible amount of violence against religious minorities, especially Muslims in India, and it's because of a certain kind of a normalizing of fascist aesthetics, basically in everyday language, under the garb of political correctness. If you look at Pakistan, what's happening in Pakistan, we've gone beyond that situation. It's not to suggest as if things are incredibly fine in Pakistan. As Sabina Qazi was pointing out, we are faced with our own set of problems where it's becoming increasingly difficult to have any kind of intelligent conversation about politics. I feel that there is little that I can contribute to what people are saying on, let's say, Twitter, on Facebook. There is no dialogue. It's no conversation. It's not an academic kind of a conversation. It's very partisan. It's very propagandist. It's very violent. If you come up with some kind of an argument, an historical reference, a legal precedence or whatever, it does not hold any point, because such are the ways in which this conversation has been set. Now, having said that, I also feel that the forms of resistance, as Sandhya was saying, I think it still is about finding and building allies. And in this day and age, I think it has always been a strategy, but now it's even more important that we understand the urgency of going beyond this idea of certain kind of ideological purity. That if you are a socialist, or if you espouse a certain kind of a leftist progressive politics, it means that you should not be in conversation with anyone who disagrees with you or has a different kind of viewpoint when it comes to economy, when it comes to religion. Or we need to embrace politics with all its contradictions, and we need to understand that it's only by acknowledging this kind of contradiction that we can build a wider kind of a coalition. On our own, we do not have this kind of strength, especially in Pakistan, where, as Hassan Saab has fantastically explained. In our case, it's been, the left did not have this kind of strength, I would say, ever, or whatever it had has long been lost. So it's always been about reaching out to other groups, even when we know that their position is starkly at times different from ours. This is one very important point as far as I'm concerned. And I think the left in India, in Pakistan, elsewhere, it gets called out for, why don't you raise your voice against this and that? And it keeps on undermining their strength instead of helping them build a wider coalition or an effective form of resistance. Lastly, I was in conversation with Ammar Alijan and a couple of other Pakistani academics and activists last week. And I asked him that, look, we have this classic case of Imran Khan, and whether we like it or not, but Imran Khan, or even Modi for that matter, they're people who have some kind of a vision. So it's a regressive vision, it's a reactionary vision. Whatever they want to do, we do not agree with it. And Trump, for instance. So what was Hillary Clinton's vision? Like, what was she offering in terms of a grand narrative, grand ideological framework? The same holds true for Modi. Whatever kind of dharmic civilization model that he wants to build, what is it that the Congress has to offer? So look at Imran Khan. He wants to build this utopian kind of the state of Medina. What is it that Maryam Nawaz has to offer, or Bilawal Bhutto has to offer in response to that? So Ammar Alijan was arguing that historically it was the left which was providing these kind of grand narratives, futuristic, utopian kind of visions, which would rally people, which would inspire people, which would make them commit to the idea of politics as a possibility of change, radical change and revolution. And now it has been appropriated, it's been wrested by the right wing. And now it seems that the left is in a very conservative mold, I would say, rather than the right, which in very contradictory terms has become kind of revolutionary in terms of claiming to remold, rebuild the world and change it. While we know we have our critique, we understand that what they're saying lacks content, that it is fascistic in its inherently in its nature, that it's regressive. But at the same time, it's the right wing which is able to galvanize people's imaginations. And this is where the left needs to come up with a radical vision, which can serve as kind of a rallying point for marginalized groups. This is what I have to say.
Thank you, Ali. And of course, this is not new. We have dealt with this in history before, and also the question of socialist strategy, whether it is in terms of like making alliances, agonistic Democrats like Chantal Mouffe and others have spoken about. Those visions do exist. I think the issue is in what way is the fascist narrative placing the left in a reactive or reactionary position, and what games do we have to play on their terms? And I think that that's the struggle here.
Now we move to the second part of our conversation with Shakuntala Banerjee and Majid Shahid.
Shakuntala Banerjee, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I've got loads to say. I always have loads to say about these kinds of issues. And obviously, it really does jump off straight from what our friends Ali and Sandhya and Sabina and Hassan have said. I think I'll start in three ways. One, by talking about how do you make anything going on in South Asia of interest to people within South Asia, outside the borders of our own countries, because I think it's very siloed, and yet the processes that we've seen happening over the past 30 years, and I think I'll take 30 years because I see the 1990s as some kind of slightly breaking point, although Sri Lanka came a little later, in terms of a joining together of fascist religious politics with neoliberal politics. And prior to that, how do you make people in Sri Lanka care what's happening in Pakistan, or people in India care what's going on in Bangladesh, in a way which is more than just to say, like, I've just been in India and loads of Modi bucks are gloating about what's happened to Sri Lanka and saying things like, we told you, don't cozy up to China. This is what would happen. And I'm like, hang on a second, Modi bucks. I also told them, don't cozy up to China, because it's very clear what will happen if you get bad debts and, you go into these kinds of things. So how could we have avoided this situation? How can we be interested in learning from each other? And then how do you get people in other parts of the world, not necessarily in sort of Russia or the US, to care and to be interested and to teach us from their types of solidarity? So how do you get people in indigenous movements in Colombia and Brazil, or people in Thailand and Hong Kong, or even dissidents within China and Russia to be interested in and teach and learn from those of us working in and on South Asia? So how do you have those conversations? I mean, it's actually very interesting to think about a podcast like this, and who's going to listen to it, who's going to learn from it. Are we always talking to the converted? And obviously those of us who teach or write for a living have to really consider who we're speaking to. So I completely acknowledge Sandhya's point that it's sometimes very frightening to speak, and it's sometimes silencing, Sabina. Yes, I have been in a place where someone tells me, after I've just talked between supposed school friends, someone tells me, I think if you continue talking like this, the next time I see you will be at your candlelit vigil. And so that's the kind of position we're in. So how do you make people interested in it? I think it's absolutely right, Hassan, that we have to go back to history. We do have to sort of talk about the history, but we have to do it in a way which makes it accessible, both to people who read tweets and who go on Instagram, as well as to people who've never spoken Urdu or Hindi or Punjabi in their lives, and who are in other places, who are in Iran or somewhere else. And the vocabularies of democracy have been so degraded by the way in which they've been used that you need almost to sort of build a vocabulary of democracy from the ground. So that's the second thing I want to say. Where does hope lie when the reality is so vicious that you feel guilty actually theorizing about democracy when you know that your next door neighbor is being boycotted because of their religion, or you know that wearing a cross could get you beaten to death on the street, and you feel guilty sitting in a university and doing that. And so then the only consolation becomes, okay, I'm hoping that by my presence, 3 students who might otherwise have been part of a mob will no longer be part of that mob. And that is literally the only consolation. Yeah. And then the third thing I want to say is a theoretical point, and it is more about the way in which we in the social sciences and humanities have for years taught subjects like political science, philosophy, political economy, in opposition to studies around media, communication, cultural studies. And we've seen one as hard theoretical subjects and the other as sort of soft, wishy-washy ones. Meanwhile, there was none of this kind of methodological nationalism or divisive disciplinary boundaries going on within the thinking processes of the right and the far right. So for 30 years, while we were busy either doing political economy or thinking about fascism, they've been deploying fascism through political economy in the media systems of India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Right. And you have seen very clearly how state media systems, which used to have, and perhaps in, sort of in the Nehruvian socialist days of India and in sort of the nation building anti-colonial days, have some kind of vision of being against imperialism and for the people, or for a development which was for the people, have slowly been eroded. And we're told all in the name of greater freedom of speech, by being privatized, by being sold off, by being atomized. And I think there was a moment, perhaps, when I was working on a book on South Asian media in the early 2000s, between 1995 and 2005, there was a moment in almost all these countries where it was true that there was a certain kind of plurality, both in fiction media and in non-fiction media. But what we didn't see enough was how, responding to that moment, we needed to talk about regulation of that media space. And really quickly, before any of us had got our act together in Sri Lanka, for example, it was clear that the media was being deployed again for genocidal aims, that it was being deployed against particular language communities, against particular communities, and it was being taken over by the state despite being owned by individuals. And the same went for the media in India. The larger the stakes, the more control on foreign direct investment, it appeared that the government was protecting the interests of the populace, while actually what they were doing was installing their own people in these foreign-owned portions of companies. So for instance, you would even say that once Facebook entered India, it was basically indigenized and polarized towards fascism because of the kinds of people that were put in charge of Facebook India. And that's clearly been shown through the whistleblowers. The same goes for Turner International or Nickelodeon, in the kinds of programs which I was tracking in the early 2000s, which were being brought out for 4 and 5-year-olds. These are the very 4 and 5-year-olds who are now in their mid-20s or in their early 20s and are participating in the mobs which throw stones at or cheer on the bulldozers for the bringing down of houses of minority communities. And the fact that we didn't see the coming together of political economy and capital, which neoliberal capital was taught as being this sort of radical force which dissolved global boundaries, globalization as the good bringing down of sort of nationalist sentiment. Actually, neoliberalism was being tailored in Sri Lanka, in India, in China, to a very peculiar nationalized form, which would then also appeal through cultural products to people while enabling the manufacture of mass disinformation. So 3 things come out of the work that we've recently been doing in my department and with various colleagues across India and Sri Lanka on the mass manufacture of disinformation and misinformation. One, that a lot of people used to think that if you talk political propaganda online or in the news, it's not popular. It won't sell. So people used to tell me in the late 1990s that Hindi cinema is always going to be secular. It's always going to be secular because the public is not interested in going and sitting down and watching something that's not secular. Lie number 1, or very foolish huge miscalculation because Bollywood was already not secular. It had a kind of soft Hindu chauvinist line, which it had towed for years and years. It became hard because actually, yes, those products did sell through cassettes, through music, through DJing, through the linking of a certain form of neoliberal wealth production and modernity to the Hindu identity. Those products became incredibly popular, not just in India. Those incredibly nationalist films like Gadar 2001 sold well in Pakistan. So that imaginary was there in Pakistan too. That imaginary about who can succeed, how you succeed by killing thousands of the enemy. It was a very bloodthirsty imaginary. And yet it did incredibly well at the box office. And it proved that it isn't just the critical or the, sort of the revolutionary or the radical that sells or even the soft secular, that you could have hardline fascist stuff selling. And that has only taken over more and more in the last few years. And in conjunction, those of us in India trying to have these conversations, we're only having those conversations with people in India. We were not talking to Sri Lankans about what was going on when Tamils were being massacred. We were looking inwards. There was a really sort of insular gaze. There wasn't a sense then that disinformation is actually crossing boundaries in South Asia. So for instance, the images of Muslims shared by the RSS on WhatsApp group in India were directly used in genocidal actions and boycott against Sri Lankan Muslims. And the international character of disinformation and neoliberal capitalism in South Asia is directly linked or inversely linked to the weaknesses of the left analysis or our own analysis of the nexus between capital culture and fascist politics amongst the multitude. I mean, how to make that interesting to students from China, students from Brazil, is something that I practice on a daily basis. So how to bring that in by understanding what is going on in their countries, historically, how that's related. And in our latest book on social media and hate, which really looks at disinformation and misinformation, we deliberately chose Brazil, India, Myanmar, and the UK to say, actually, look, the same thing is happening, this sort of cultural narrowing, but also the bringing in of big business and neoliberal capital, because it's so profitable. You can profit from fascism. And as long as that's happening and a few people are getting richer, the sort of hegemonized ideas around, what it means for GDP to go up or go down, the smiling success of an Imran Khan, a Modi, a Trump is always going to trump the miserable faces that we present when we say, don't you care that your neighbor is going out of business? And don't you care that your school teacher's husband was lynched? I mean, we have our narrative of misery quite rightly, Sandhya. It is horrible. I mean, on every street corner, you've got these fascist hymns being blared out and people dancing in the streets. So they have managed to capture not only the public space, but also the space for joy in South Asia. There's a kind of joyous rubbing of hands,
gleeful,
as in almost gladiatorial.
Absolutely.
And the rest of us are sort of dying of depression. So I think we need, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think we do need to rethink the way in which we communicate our politics when we have found a way of doing that.
Shakuntala, thank you so much. That's beyond what we could have imagined in terms of insight and just connecting these dots. And we were speaking a couple of times ago, Sabina, as recently as yesterday, that I'm at a point in being a political theorist, as a rogue social scientist in the US, where I keep wondering the world isn't like this, despite what we were doing. It is how it is because of what the social sciences and the entire academic establishment has been up to. Because with all the work we have done, to know countries, comparative politics, all the political sciences that just did this narrow thing and created international relations as this own kind of bizarrely reactionary field. If we were on the watch and these places were the ones that were funded, how come the world looks like? There's some design in it, right? It's not despite the knowledge production, the world is this way. Something has happened because we've produced knowledges. And I think that the transport of the neoliberal university to our countries, right, to Pakistan, to India, to Palestine. I think that there's a way in which just the narrowing of the object, right, the kind of constant shaping of the object as a geographically contained one, right, as further narrowing of what area studies meant. And we know why it started, why it was a CIA project. Everything you've said is just so profound. And yes, as much as you think it is a narrative of misery, you bring such beautiful energy and just this urgency that I think we have to communicate it outward more and more. And I'm very, very grateful. Majid, you want to step in and share where you are and
Hello, Asma and everyone. Too many things that were raised. I don't know what you did in the first. Basically, what I sensed was what could we do, and I will try to think about it in a kind of brief way, because in general, I think a few questions were like, what could we do as academics, as parents, as activists, and my view also as humans, and we should connect them together. And I think in general, we should think, of course there is difference between, there's global structures and there is local context that varies a little bit, but they are very connected. They're not completely different. Palestine is not so much different from Pakistan or India, Sri Lanka, or anywhere in the global south. They are very connected in many ways. There are global structures that actually impact the global north and impact us all the time, whether we are academics or just, parents, neighbors, humans, etc. I think, and in general, I always suggested a few things. One of them, not to think of replacing structure by structure, so that we think of like kind of guerrilla warfare, guerrilla scholarship, guerrilla activism. Doesn't need a leader. It's a network that connects, we could connect with globally on issues that are of concern to all of us around education, around social justice, around economic justice, about the freedom to be, for every group to be present in the larger state system, whether it's a religious minority, whether it's political minority, whether it's social minority, whether it's cultural minority. And then, and one thing, we don't have the power of whether it's economic power, whether it's academic power, anything. We don't have that power to really replace what's happening globally. So what we need to, I think, there is one thing I learned one time from a friend who tried to use his work was in computer science and resistance, like connecting some terms in computer science between hacking and cracking. Hacking, basically, you bring down the system and you take over it, and cracking, basically trying to intervene in it in a way that fractures whatever the structure that you want to break down, whether it's like economic exploitation, whether it's freedom of speech in general, whether it's academic freedom. We need to crack things little by little. We should not think, we could create this kind of global movement like the left usually thinks, and then suddenly things will shift. If we have that's not true, because actually the left in different places is not on the same page. And I disagree with a lot of things in the left, even in Pakistan, when I was in Pakistan, whether in India and anywhere, whether in Palestine, anywhere. I disagree with the idea. We need to pick up our fights. What party in Pakistan could replace him that is better officially? I'm not talking about outside of the system, I'm talking the official system. So we need to think of ways to crack the system and push it in a different way. Crack the system so that, because the system in Pakistan is related to the global system. Like the same thing in Palestine, the same thing in India, the same thing in Sri Lanka or anywhere else. Two, I think we need to indigenize, the whole idea of Marxist. I talk to people Marxist here, I talk to Marxists in India and Pakistan, different places, all of them. A lot of people in Marxist for more than 100 years have been talking, for example, that the first historian of Marxist, materialist historiography is Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was the first materialist historian. Actually, the ideas of Ibn Khaldun are much more large than this kind of Eurocentric, linear way of Marxist thoughts. But it includes a lot of other things in addition to this kind of fixing things. There is only class struggle, there is only this way, there is a beginning, there's an end. This is actually, even Marxist thoughts is a religious thought in my view, because there is hell and heaven in it. There is no variety, there is no complexity, because we know humans are not that simple. When I lived in Pakistan, I was shocked, to see how all this progressive talk is not translated into the daily life. We should also translate our big talk about the left and Marxism and so on into daily practice. I critique the political system in Pakistan or in India or in Palestine or anywhere, or Sri Lanka, and then at the same time I'm being abusive to nature, I'm being abusive to the animals around me, I'm being abusive to the workers and exploiting them openly. It's very clearly, it's very open. So we have to be real on a personal level, real and human on a social level, and also on a political beautifully. So I think we need to disrupt systems on a local level, to disrupt unjust ways of dealing with nature, dealing with animals, dealing with other humans, dealing with minorities, etc., etc. I need also to disrupt the larger system in the country, and I need to connect globally, which was how could I connect with Latin America? I connect with them on economic justice.
Maybe one person will decide how I connect to Latin America, but that it should be in the realm of possibility for me to think I have a connection at all.
No, we could connect with them because there is every place has specific issues, but there are general issues globally because the system today. I was trying in one article using a concept by Ibn Khaldun, Asabiyya, solidarity, as a way to frame things, solidarity in a global frame, because he was talking about it in a social group. But the system was not globalized as today, so we need to think about it in a global framework, a global way. We need to create local things.
And it depends, of course, like who you are, right? And I think the question that you're raising about class and caste and these particular distinctions, I think it's, of course, the question of who you are also, right? So, I mean, we can't have a political conversation that isn't asking, for whom we are talking about or about whom we are saying something, so the generalities, I completely understand that, like, how we create that generality is our job, how we create what contains something, and it will not be decided by one thinker or, and I think even in terms of what being Marxist means so many different things. So clearly we're not looking for ideological purity. I think it's very clear from all of us that none of us are purist, but I think that also means that the contradictions between us, Sartre would say, right, like humanity in general and humanity like in specific, right? Like we come often from parents who were able to do one and not the other. And sometimes we are the ones able to do one and not the other, and absolutely appreciate your point. And there's also a way in which, when you study the history of fascism, the question of violence is not always an outcome. It's a premonition, right? Violence towards young people, violence toward women. And I think that's something that when we are always seeing time moving in a certain way, we forget the temporality of politics is not simply this linearity. It's not just questions of consequence. It's more Brechtian and less modernist, right? Like it's not, we're always anticipating the next thing. It's almost as if that we know. The question is like, what forms of violence among us eventually perform a different kind of sublime violence that fascism presents itself as, but it's actually all of these ordinary things that we do. Rishak wants to say something about this question of how this leads us as to go back to the question of South Asia solidarity, but also really what does it mean to no longer be able to write about one thing alone? Like how do we speak as if we are speaking for us, but also more than us?
Everything that Majid said really sparked a lot of, obviously passion, because this is something that I feel very, very strongly about. The whole situation in India in the relation to the treatment of domestic labor and the way in which servants are sort of treated was absolutely on my mind. And coming from a family where we've never, ever had domestic help. And now thinking, I always used to sort of think through Marx's dictum around, to each according to their labor, from each according to their need or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think now when you see what's happened, you realize that it's something that you have to work on both psychologically as well as politically. And I tell my students, when they come from their very, very wealthy homes to LSE, many of them, how many of you have washed your own underwear? How much do you know about cleaning your own bathrooms and your shit? And then you can go and work in the development world. Problem is, I go back and I visit many people, and that has not happened. They haven't changed. Yeah. And that's because it's really, really difficult to change, because even the people you're ostensibly doing this on behalf of don't understand what you're trying to do. And so, Majid, I understand. I passionately want to change that. But you have to bring with it an imaginative framework, which maybe comes from movies or some kind of poetry. And it does happen in certain types of villages and in indigenous populations, but it's not popularized. The second thing I want to say was talking to trade unionists in India. They watched through the 1980s how the trade union movement was radicalized in terms of communalism, and how suddenly solidarities and bargaining were around issues to do with whether or not the Hindu workers wanted to work alongside Muslim workers, or whether they wanted women in the workplace workplace taking their jobs, so issues of sort of gender or issues of religion were used very carefully by the far right. And now almost every trade union across this vast country has been communalized and taken over, and so can be mobilized. Not everyone, but many, and can be just taken over at the flip of a finger to aid in the fascist project. But that's because we weren't, we're still operating on the notion of that old, Marxist solidarity that class would somehow bind these people together. We're going to go in and mobilize them. Yes, we did. We made feminist groups.
But why didn't we see what happened in the US? Why weren't we learning?
Exactly.
Like all of these things have happened already, to better days. I thought, Hassan Saab, just the question of the way the trade unions were both infiltrated by the right wing, right, in Pakistan, and how early that was done, and how much somebody like Bhutto had a role to play in that clean path through trade unions by right-wing parties. So you have some thoughts on that, maybe to share, just to bring home what Majid and Shakuntala were saying?
Yes, actually, as we are saying that the discourse no longer belong to us anymore. For suppose that hum dekhenge, we'll take it face and we will see changes. Now it's taken over by Imran Khan's julus. They are singing and dancing over it. Or Shehbaz Sharif, now they're saying Deep Jiska Mahalat Hi Mein Jale. So the same happened to Bhutto actually jump on this, band, which was, actually waved. The dreams are waved by the left, actually the labor movement, which is a history even long before the partition in Karachi. Minister even Inder Kamal Gujral would work with the labor and on. So, but Bhutto jumped over it. But in practical, when Bhutto came to power, he brutally cursed the labor movement.
Yes.
And so far, Majid Sahib's, discourse. In South Asia, they totally failed what Majid Sahib said. It's the Palestinian experience cannot be applied to South Asia. This discourse, this is also taken over by the right. This discourse has also been taken over by Uzam thing, destroy everything. I've been listening to this discourse, 50 years ago. Now my friend, he came back from Cuba and he was very excited. I said, we used to be excited. We are in 20s. So in South Asia, we have to create our own course, our own struggle. According to violent means of any action have been totally failed. It totally failed. Be it is Bhagat Singh, I'm sorry, it is the Hemu Kalani, or this one Altaf Hussain, or Che Guevara, I think can't going to apply.
Yeah, and I think what was referred to also earlier, the marriage between neoliberalism and a kind of nationalism that has happened both in India and Pakistan. It's a particular class background. Everybody we are speaking about, in some ways referring to in our sort of brief conversation, are people with means. I think it's become sort of the normalized subject that Majid is talking about, that, we're upset with, and it isn't the reality of the majority of any of our countries, right? To say that these people who have represented, the progressive left or the development world are anyway the majority of the places we are speaking about. That's also interesting, that who has taken over the discourse, right? Who has now amassed the means of cultural production as well as like subjective production, the production of who we are as subjects, this deep, cavernous, neoliberal fascist subject that's product of all of these small actions. And I think there's something to be said that some stories just have not been told enough for them to be inspiring to anybody at all. So it's not like we have done enough and failed. I think that may be one degree of hope I have, is that perhaps we haven't even tried a few things because we were so wrapped up in a kind of mimicry that comes with our station in this geopolitical realm. What are you thinking, Sabina?
When Shakuntala was talking, I was thinking of when you and I were talking yesterday, and imperialism, for example, in the neoliberal, we have intra-state imperialism, don't we? We have colonial structures and we don't know how to break away from those colonial structures. And if you really sit and think about it, it's gotten, I don't know if it's gotten worse or if it's, I don't think it's gotten better for sure.
I loved Shaku bringing up the question of indigenous indigenous populations and others, because we have understood settler colonialism to be such a foreign thing, such an exception, that we actually don't understand that all the conditions we live in are settler colonial. Somebody has been settled, somebody has been erased, somebody has been eradicated in order for us to be where we are. And there's no other way to put it here. So instead of saying how our histories are different, in what ways does settler colonial, like Palestine and the movements there, inform the ways that we might be able to think about movements against internal colonizations and these constant settling of the Baloches, the Pashtuns, the Dalits, the Shias, the Hazara in Kabul.
What Shakuntala said, that it's this expression, this release of energy, there's certain kind of a joy that you see in these lynch mobs, right?
Yeah.
So it's not as if something serious, somber, right? It's a form of sport, and it's thrilling. It's a thrill. It's also that we need to be seriously engaged with the categories that we work with, the political vocabulary, as Marge is saying, that it's to just presume that the veracity or the authenticity of terms like democracy or even class, as it said, that the way trade unions have been criminalized and the way much of this violence, it's coming from classes that you would otherwise not associate with these kinds of, at least theoretically. So that needs to be a serious consideration as to why there is a certain kind of an aspirational lifestyle which fed by this new liberal logic that you pointed out, and that's going to be a major consideration in this whole question of building alliances. And lastly, as Hassan Saab was pointing out about Faz's poetry, so this commodification of revolution, basically, it's a thing. So revolution will be televised on Coke Studio. I think that's the reality that we live in. That's all.
But when the father holds a child and says, I will kill my child for Imran Khan, there's something to be thought about. That's something I had not seen. It's very new for me. I always used to tell my father, you did live in better times than we are living. I felt like he could call people comrades, and we are sort of a little bit at a loss anyway.
Those were objectively better times.
Yes. Other possibilities of joy also,
I just wanted to say, Asma, I just want to go back to the question of the joint project of nationalism and neoliberalism that you were talking about. And it just struck me, Hassan Saab was talking about Hum Dekhenge and how Hum Dekhenge has been used in Kashmir Files in India by Vivek Agnihotri, and he turned against the very idea of Hum Dekhenge or the very concept of hum. And also thinking about what you said about knowledge production, I think that's very, very important. I think that's the crucial element here, and it's very, very apropos to this discussion today, because a huge part of the problem is who gets to set the terms of the debate or of identity or of futures, of selves and subjectivities at this point in history. And we're not just looking at alliances between the people and, let's say, democratic organizations, but I think we also have to look at the alliances between the fascists and their deep relations with extractive and surveillance capital, and which has been turning data, people into data network for mining, to be mined for information, and where all of our subjectivities are always already being produced and in servers somewhere located elsewhere. But also at the same time, perhaps our possibilities for resistance are also being produced by capital and by these fascist alliances, and without our knowledge or without any capacity to even imagine what is really happening on the other side. And because I look around and what I see is, and of course all of this, the hatred and the jingoism and the fascism and everything else in the march of doom, so to speak. But it's almost like this world it sometimes presents itself as a simulacra of billionaire fantasies of a grand colonizing project, and where it is not just this world, but also other worlds, other planets. These are their fantasies, and these are quite bound and tied up with what is happening with all of us today.
Exactly.
And so if an Elon Musk is attempting to now take control of Twitter and turn it to his megaphone, for his Mars project at some point, I'm guessing that these have deep, relations. What effects and consequences does that have for us in South Asia, in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and everywhere? Especially when we know that, for example, just last week, the UK came up with a new proposal to send illegal immigrants not back to their own countries to be tried, and not to deport them to their own countries, but to send them to, detention centers in Rwanda. So where all of these different spaces on the planet are being turned into further enclosures structures and carceral spaces. Increasingly, I think in India, I feel this extremely suffocating closing in of this nation as a carceral space, which does not let you speak, which does not let you exist multiply, but only in its own imagination of who you can be as a subject, as a citizen. So I think all of these are quite tied, and if we are to fight any kind of, or if we are to come together in any kind of alliance, we also have to be quite aware of the larger coalition of the fascists as well.
And because it is nation who taught us about that subject, how to make those subjects. The capital didn't begin knowing to do that, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's a great point to end, but maybe a final benediction from Majid.
No, just I think the discussion is like important, like how to connect, the personal with the group, the national, the global. I think it's very important not to be different things in different places, to be real all the time. Even though we cannot change things in every place, or even globally, the structure is like quite very powerful. It's not like easy to change it, but we can do like small things in the sense, for example, even small things, but like let's say wherever you are, and try to change things in the family, in the house, in the institution, and disrupt the evil things that the neoliberal, the colonial, that gets transplanted different ways, but more or less is the same. The more you go around, it's the same in many ways. So, and also indigenizing. Every movement, every theory that we know of had its local history. I know from our region that we have anarchist system hundreds of years ago. We had anarchism, we had socialism, we had communism without being called that way.
Right.
So we need to indigenize it and try to connect with global issues.
And indigenizing across spaces, I think that's the other part, is to understand from other indigenizations. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time today. And we will see each other in a couple of weeks again. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz. Bye-bye.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz.
Bye. Thank you.